Excited to host this panelist conversation today with our esteemed guest, Dr. Dryssa Case, Dr. Ezekiel Joubert, and our very own Kasim Shanaba. We really wanted to bring this conversation to you to really investigate and explore the role SEL plays and how we service our students, particularly the role that white supremacy impacts SEL, and what can we do as an organization to really think about how we can progress to use SEL towards our anti-racism goals. I'm going to take some time to allow each panelist to introduce themselves and give you a little bit about their background in addition to the biographies that you received in the emails that I sent out to you. And we'll have about a 40-minute conversation. It'll be an open conversation and exchange. I think you'll find it pretty exciting. We had a brief conversation yesterday and it flowed really well. And then we'll follow that with a 15-minute Q&A. I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So Dr. Case, you mind going first to introduce yourself?
Travis. As Travis said, my name's Dryssa Case. I am in Minneapolis. And I think just a little bit about my experience. I started in a high school classroom almost 20 years ago as a social studies and avid teacher, and transitioned after about 10 years in the classroom to higher education, where I spent most of my time in teacher preparation programs, really thinking about and working with undergraduate and graduate students to think about like the gaps and erasures in teacher prep and how those particular gaps and erasures serve to perpetuate systems of power and oppression, most explicitly white supremacy in K-12 schools. And in my own work, thinking a lot about like, what does liberatory work look like in schools? And specifically as a person who identifies as white, what is the racially specific labor of white folks who desire to stand in solidarity for racial justice at school? And so I think right now I'm in a position as an equity coordinator in a K-12 school district, and I work in deep coalition and relationship with social workers in my district around restorative practices, trauma-informed work, and centering equity and justice in SEL. And I think the last thing I want to say are just some core beliefs that I hold is that I see education as movement work. I see education as a potential space for liberation, depending upon the collective commitments of the folks in that space. And I believe that coalitional models, relationship, and deep critical reflection are tools to support liberatory practices. Thank you.
Then next we have Dr. Ezekiel Joubert.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to meet you all and be here in this space and hold space with some people that I'm very close to. So just a little bit about my background. I grew up in Michigan. I'm now in LA, but my road to thinking through and working with SEL comes through teaching. So after I left undergraduate school, I became a teaching assistant and then later a special education teacher for a charter school in Philadelphia. I worked there for about 8 years before going to graduate school. So most of my interest in teaching is driven by my experience as a special education teacher. After moving to Minnesota, where I met Dr. Case, and we did some work together there, I've been working in teacher preparation courses, especially teaching child and youth development courses. So working with the field of educational psychology to really work with prepare teachers for their teacher credentials and as well. From my own work, I'm really interested in organic intellectualism and activism from small towns. I grew up in a rural community out in Michigan, and I've been really working to uncover and recover and reclaim the activist roots from those communities, especially working with the youth. I'm also interested in how youth respond, collaborate, and collectively respond and resist the oppressive structures of school. And so a lot of what I talk about in my work and with my work with teacher preparation is to unpack how students are actually resisting school, right, through their behaviors versus how are they acting out or any of those, kind of like the way we kind of normally would stereotype student behavior. But I'm actually think that they have some agency. Students do. I believe this, right? As a part of my how I imagine education is that students have agency and they are making choices to keep themselves safe from the harms of the oppressive structures of school. And so at this point, I can talk a little bit about my philosophy here. One of the things I'm really thinking about, especially with the social and emotional piece, is that most of the time when we talk about student development, we refer to intellectual development. We always want to focus on student academic performance, and we must include a social and emotional piece. I feel like it's crucial for students to interrogate, right, and understand society and also psychology and how those help improve and create a healthy human beings. And I'll stop there. Good to be with y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Jobert. Full disclosure, I've known Dr. Jobert for 20 years, so it's very hard for me to sit here and call him Dr. Jobert and not use his nickname. So bear with me. Hopefully it doesn't slip out at some point. Kazim, you mind going next? Thank you.
Sure. And a lot of you folks here at Partnership know me, but just for the purpose of this panel, I'll just share more context about myself. So I was born and raised in New York. I'm from the Bronx. From my master's degree, I got my master's degree from Lehman College, and I've been with Partnership. I'm going into my 6th school year, and I worked in different capacities. So I was a social worker, I was a senior social worker, I was a community school director, a social work director, and now I'm currently a program director. And in all those positions, I've always taken pride in culture building. So really utilizing trauma-informed work to inform how we best support the respective schools that I've been in. And just really just supporting young people and giving them a space to talk about how they're feeling and their families, and just giving them a different opportunity to try to change the trajectory of their lives. I definitely concur with both of their philosophies, Dr. Case and Dr. Jobert. I think for me, one of my biggest philosophies, I say this often, is that I do this work to restore humanity. And really just how I do that in capacity with school, but how do we restore humanity? And for me, it's always understanding how do we even get to this place of racism. So exploring that with young people and with their families, and collaborating with like-minded stakeholders to do this work. So that's really my philosophy and what really guides me to do this work.
Thank you, Kazim. And so one of the things you'll observe in this conversation is that we kind of will matrix between theory, policy, and practical application as we discuss some of these topics. And you see the different personalities and aspects that the different panelists bring. One of the key points that came out of a resource that I shared out to you guys in the email that Dr. Case shared with me was an article about white supremacy and SEL, was a conversation that stated that SEL conversations, practices, and curriculum often base the ideal student around white cisgender patriarchal norms and values that further enact emotional and psychological violence against Black, Brown, and LGBTQ youth. And I just wanted to start off the conversation with really examining what that issue is and what is the answer to make SEL more responsive to those different groups. I think Zeke, Dr. Jobert, I think you'd be the first person I want to pose this question to.
And so when I think about the relationship between social emotional learning and white supremacy, right? I think about drawing from mostly Bettina Love and Dina Simmons kind of perspectives and thinking about these things. And just also Toshalis, who is an educational psychologist, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I really think if you don't abolish, right, if we're not abolishing racism or confronting racism, resisting racism, having an anti-racist approach, then we can't do SEL work, right? I think that we have to start from that understanding, right? That if we're not examining the ways in which race, patriarchy, so we think about gender oppression, homophobia, where if we're not, don't have a relationship with a collective relationship with doing an analysis of oppression in schools, then we can't do real SEL work. I think we just have to start from that standpoint. As for someone who works with teachers, right? And one of the things I really want to put forward today is that we see all of ourselves as educators. We're working in an education space. I know that there is a somewhat of a division, right? Or an imagined kind of border between what social workers do and also teachers, right? As educators. But I like to imagine that anyone working in the lives of students are educators. And we all have pedagogies, right? We all have teaching philosophies and teaching practices and approaches. And I think that's super important for us to ground ourselves in that belief, right? That we all have pedagogies and approaches to teaching, whether we're teaching in the classroom space or we're doing it from an administration space, we're all working with children. And it all is informed by our pedagogy. And so with that being said, thinking about from a developmental perspective, like I said before, we usually break down development as being either intellectual development, social development, and emotional development. When I teach my students about social and emotional development, we usually are referring to things like motivation, perceptions of ability, right? We know these things, right? How motivated is a student? Are they motivated to learn? And so we do assessments around those things, right? Or we assess what are their perceptions of their abilities? Do they believe they're good in math class? Or, all these things in the social situations as well. But one thing I talk about and a theory that I provide for my students is resistance theory. So resistance theory comes from Eric Toshalis. And one of the things that he really talks about in this idea is that for students, especially marginalized students, right, they are aware of all of these structures in schools. We like to pretend, right, as adults and educators, the students aren't aware of how standardized testing is racist, right? We're not aware of how school structures discipline and order the bodies of minority students, or marginalized students, or minoritized students is what I was trying to say there. And so, but students are, right? They understand the policies, they see them, right? They might not always have the language for them, but they feel them. It's embodied, right? Because we know that learning is an embodied experience. And what they're doing through their behaviors and through their actions are actually resisting these forces that are going upon their bodies, right? And so I teach my students using this idea, because what happens is if we don't engage in these student resistance as educators, right, then what we will do is reproduce the same structures, right? And so this is the dichotomy. If you don't engage in the student's resistance into those resistive behaviors, and sometimes those resistive behaviors are just like shutting down and not participating, right? Right. And we call them, oh, those students may be unmotivated, but really what they're doing is resisting the harm, right? They're not willing to take the risk to put their heads out there because they know that they're going to be disciplined, ordered, punished, especially if you're a person of color, seen as that they're not smart, devalued, right? Their belief systems are devalued when we're talking about race and other structures as well. And so what we want to do is, as education workers, as people in the field, is engage in that student resistance through relationality, not just through assessment, right? So relationships are super important in order to understand why these students are resisting any of the factors related to school. It could be, the curriculum, it could be the teacher's pedagogy, it could be the policies or the institution itself, right? And we need to get down to the root of why they're resisting schools if we want to do the social and emotional learning work that we want to do. And I'll stop there and then we can kind of keep continue the conversation.
Dr. Case, do you want to respond to that by chance?
Sure. I think as Ezekiel was talking and I was listening to him, I was thinking about a handful of systems level pieces, right? Like, how does this play out, like in a moment with an individual student inside of a collective classroom community, but also how does the system shape the predictability of those moments? And I think that one of the ways I'm thinking about in my work on a regular basis, like with a whole group of folks, is how do the values of white supremacy culture shape everything? And I think that one of those ways is isolation and individualism, right? That we imagine all of our work inside of schools as like happening in their own silos. And I think that, I I'd be curious to hear Kazim's perspective on this. I think that that plays out onto social workers all the time, right? Like social workers wear specific hats coming into spaces and are expected to, like have the magic fix for something, but then they're not deeply included in community. And I think a couple things that I wanted to add to the conversation is, number one, I think that critical analysis institutionally needs to be a deep commitment and present all the time, right? So how are we thinking about the ways that systems of power and oppression shape any given context,
Right.
And how the values of whiteness, of capitalism, of heteronormativity are creating our values and deeply held assumptions that go unexamined. And so I think about, Dina Simmons calls SEL white supremacy with a hug. And I think the way that happens, after our conversation yesterday, when we were prepping for this, I went on a walk with my partner, and she's thinking about and studying somatics, and the way that the body has a role in healing and deeply understanding trauma, and especially really how that can be used as a way to disrupt whiteness in space inside of a classroom as a teacher. And I bring this up because in her class yesterday, the instructor was talking about the way in which dysregulation is seen and attended to inside of schools from like a really ill-conceived space. He said that oftentimes there's like a misunderstanding of dysregulation, because when we see a quote unquote dysregulated body, right, whether it's angry, has rage, has grief, has overwhelm, anxiety, panic, whatever label we're going to put on that emotionally, that the assumption to regulate the body is that the body must be calm, right? The body must be calmed in order to be seen as regulated. And really that's like a perspective of white supremacy, right? Emotional restraint, right? You're only valuable if you are calm, logical, controlled. And they were saying that healthy regulation is really the body's ability to respond appropriately to any given context. So when Ezekiel is talking about resistance, I think, witnessing students' anger or rage or resistance as really actually an extremely healthy, regulated, body responding to an unjust system. And even that shift of perspective, like what would happen inside of spaces where we're thinking about SEL as a central component to an education that values a whole child. I think that is a really powerful shift. So I think that's just what I wanted to add in this moment.
Thank you. And I think you offered a question to Kazim. I don't know, Kazim, did you capture that question and have a response to it?
I think I do. My reference is my practice, so I'm going to speak to that. And I think the folks at our partnership have a unique role to kind of disrupt some of these oppressive systems and do the exact work that Dr. Case and Dr. Joubert was just speaking about. I think it's important for us to acknowledge our children's experiences. So if children are they're angry or they're upset, that's the opportunity for us to acknowledge that. As we know, behaviors are symptoms of actual problems. So when we don't acknowledge that and we just kind of ignore, we want the kids just to behave, just to sit down and do their work, we're not acknowledging their experience. I think a lot of schools are pressured by metrics to do certain things like test scores, so on and so forth. And it kind of takes away from actually supporting our students. So to kind of answer that question, or at least if I feel like I'm mirroring that question, it's just, again, it's really using SEL and being culturally responsive to highlight those things to best support our students.
Yeah, from that conversation piece that we had yesterday, one of the things I kept thinking about is a Rage Against the Machine quote, "Your anger is your gift," right? And in driving my work here, my anger about the things that happen in the social justice world really feeds my work. And so we talk about students being observant about the things they experience. How can we harness that anger instead of regulating their bodies? So I thank you guys for that conversation point. Another thing that Dr. Joubert brought up, Kazim, is this idea that everyone in the building is an educator And there's a sense that the educators the actual teachers can learn from social workers and really improve this practice in the building. I would like to start off with just having a conversation with you, Kazim, about in your experience, what has that been like, and how do you kind of embed PwC's practices and social worker practices into the school system, into a school structure, and really get buy-in from administration, from teachers, and so forth?
Yeah, like, I think the marriage in our schools is how to support children's social emotional so they're able to yield like the best academic results. But you're not gonna do that if you don't understand the communities that you're working in and the trauma, the compound trauma that the children have experienced. So it's really providing like professional development opportunities for school staff around those compound traumas and how to identify how to best support students. And one of the schools that I worked in, this summer, like last year, unfortunately, when George Floyd was murdered, we had a lot of teacher like support groups, and we spoke about some of those things. And I think what came out of some of those groups, one of the teachers, she wanted to do a book club for a book called Other People's Children by Lisa Delpit. So I support that teacher in planning for that particular book club. And so she essentially ran it like bi-weekly, in which we would meet to talk about different topics. One of them was talking about code switching. And then we got into a conversation about, how do we honor children's language, but at the same time acknowledge that children have to navigate these oppressive systems by using standard English. So having those kind of conversations with the teachers. Like having like so for instance, if the team is providing like SEL lessons to the school staff, how do you tag in the teachers to see what the children are learning? Because at the same time, the staff are uncomfortable with some of the topics. So we were talking about racism, we were talking about the 2020 election, topics that they haven't even like come to like face or whatnot. So really like talking to the staff about that to process that, because if you haven't processed that, there's no way you're gonna be able to sit down with the students and be with them in that same space. The work has to all connect. And lastly, doing affinity groups with the school staff, like so they can process their own biases and their own experiences as they come into the space. Again, like they have the privilege and the opportunity to come into those spaces and educate those children. So it's important that you're educated about a lot of the social ills that inform what the children are bringing into the school building. So those are some ways that we kind of address some of those items.
Thank you. And one of the things I think that Dr. Jobert highlights in his work is that concept of like collaborative practice with social workers in the classroom and in the school setting. I just wanted to dig deeper into that conversation, Dr. Jobert. So hearing on a practical standpoint, some of the things that Kazim has applied, how have you seen that come to fruition in your work, or how do you educate your students for when they become educators to incorporate this type of work into their pedagogy?
Yeah, so just thinking about a collaborative critical praxis, this is something that I developed with Dr. Case when we were trying to, as teacher educators, trying to demystify this idea that teaching is an individual activity, right? Teaching is not an individual activity, neither is being a social worker, right? We're all collectively in an institution, working through the set of technologies that build the system, right? And so one of the things that we talk about when we think about a collaborative critical praxis is critical reflection that has to be done collectively, right? We are in many ways doing this critical reflection together as a way to learn about ourselves, but also to learn about the institution itself. And so an example for me, comes out of my own experience as a special education teacher. I worked really, really close with the social worker at my school. I was thankful that we had a full-time or part-time social worker, someone in the school doing the therapeutics, doing the SEL trainings with the students, but not with the staff, right? And so for me, as someone working with students who were continuously labeled, especially Black boys and Black girls, labeled as socially emotional disturbed, right? Having these things on their IEPs, I was worried about the interventions that I was learning from school and how they were reproducing, right? Racism and through the IEP. And I was worried about the ways in which they were enforced by teachers, right? They were doing this kind of behavior of punishing and disciplining, using SEL as a way to punish and discipline and to further, I think, oppress these students. And so I often saw the team work between me and myself and the social worker is super, super important of developing a practice. And that means that we had to go and look and think deeply about our own approaches. We sit down, we put our things in front of us, we ask questions about them, right? A part of a praxis is thinking about what undergirds it theoretically. What are my philosophies? What are my epistemologies? You know, like doing some of this thing that Kareem is talking about, like looking at your own cultural understandings, your political understandings. So not just cultural, but what are your politics around these approaches that we have, right? And then we question each other and we debate. We go back and forth. We're in dialogue with each other in order to disrupt, right? A lot of times what I saw ourselves is working in the undercommons of the school. You know, a lot of times we weren't included into what basic teacher trainings because we were special ed teachers or social workers. And what we did was create a space for ourselves, a collective space for ourselves to make sense of our school in order to resist and to be in solidarity with our students.
That's awesome. In creating that solidarity with your students, I know that on a policy level, Dr. Case speaks about trying to create a school district that's liberatory for students of color. And so thinking of this collaborative approach and with the goal of being liberatory, how do we actually form this system? Or how do you create policies that embed this system? I'm going to offer that to Dr. Case.
Yeah, I think that I'm thinking a lot about it from multiple entry points, right? How are we working on creating and imagining multiple entry points together? So for instance, like a small micro level entry point, you know, when Ezekiel was talking about, you know, what does a collaborative critical praxis look like, is one of the ways that we have grown what professional development looks like is that all professional development is, regardless of the topic, is done in alignment with our equity framework that is committed to a justice orientation. So it must be critical. It must examine what conditions are necessary to create humanizing spaces. It must include agency, right? So really, like, how are folks seen, valued, and heard, and seen as co-constructors of their educational experience? And I'm particularly thinking about students, families, and caregivers. And really, what does authentic relationship look like and feel like if all three of those things are happening? It's critical, it's humanizing, there's agency. And so one of the things that we're doing is folks are in critical friend groups, right? It's not just learning alongside yourself, or especially in this moment, right? Where we're all staring at screens all the time. But where is that connection to deeply reflect in relationship with other people? And, you know, thinking about how I think a lot about radical love, right? From especially the way that Bell Hooks talks about love, like, are we committed to each other's spiritual growth? And when I think about, you know, systems of power and oppression in this, that is one way to think about healing work, right? That we are working to unlearn and heal from the impacts of systems of power and oppression, how they live in and through us, as well as impact our bodies, depending upon the ones that we are in as we move through the world. And so I think that being in relationship and dialogue is so, so crucial. And I know I didn't get to your policy, but I think, like, so often our leaders are the most resistant, right? The folks who hold the most power are the most resistant to change. And so I want to come back and talk about coalition, right? Coalition, what does it look like to really build relationship inside of a system grounded in clear and common commitments, where we are talking about desires, where we're creating space for imagination, because really radically shifting a system, I think about various abolitionist practices here and philosophies, to dream and create something new together. And I see somebody just pop in, Abolitionist Teaching Network. Yes, like, I'm so excited for their first conference in 2022, because I want to be in a space with folks who are nationally and collectively committed to that. So I think like policy transforms when individual practice, thinking, commitment transforms. I don't necessarily think that policy comes first, even though it can. But I have a colleague right now who is really talking a lot about, I'm tired of convincing people. I'm tired of convincing people that I matter, that my children matter, right? That our children matter. Like, that's not the business that I want to be in. So what does it look like to shift and invest in building and growing coalition instead of like always knocking on the doors of folks you got to convince?
That's great. That last point, it completely erases the question I had for you about how do you convince a white cisgender male math teacher that this practice is good practice. I think you answered that question. So I'm just going to skip ahead and offer this to the entire panel in the interest of time. We have like 2 minutes until the Q&A. One of the key things I think we as an organization want to hear from the panel is a conversation around the role that social workers can play as a resource for developing equity goals. And that's maybe system-wide equity goals or more micro down to the particular school. And also just kind of understand how can we root SEL practices and restorative justice practices in a district-wide equity initiative. So when you have administrative folks come up with these initiatives, how do we make sure that this practice is embedded in their understanding of goals, concepts, achievements, et cetera? And that's just open to the entire panel. Whoever wants to grab it first, feel free.
So just kind of thinking about our conversation yesterday and just some of the things that Dr. Case is talking about with coalition buildings. One of those coalitions have to be the community. You know, our work is place-based. It's so important for us to understand the communities in which our schools take place, right? And what that means is not just, you know, getting a survey from parents or including them in a meeting, sitting at the table. It actually means doing some participatory work with them, finding out what their questions are. How do they envision school, right? A community's vision for a school often differs, right? And often embraces some of this resistance that we've been talking about in this panel. And so we really need to understand and unpack what it is that the community wants and needs from the school space. And a lot of that has to do with safety, right? When we're thinking about social and emotional learning, they want their kids to get to school safe. One of the things that I've been working on is looking at how long it takes for a child to get from schools, especially in our current, you know, neoliberal charter school systems, right? Children are traveling, when I lived in Philly, traveling over an hour, a 6-year-old on a bus. What does that do to their social and emotional learning, right? And so what we really need to do is not just include the voices, but include the ideas and the practices and knowledge from those communities in order to build coalitions with parents and community members, and see them as intellectuals and see them as people who have analysis of the school spaces that are valuable for transforming the school. So in order to do any policy justice or any type of equity policies district-wide, the community members have to be considered. I'll say that.
I think, unless anyone wants to chime in further on Dr. Jobert's great summary of the importance of the community, which I think as an organization, we buy in completely on that concept. I'd like to open up the forum to any questions that folks may have. Angela, do you want to are we going to keep it in the chat, or do you want to just take everyone off of mute, and anyone who wants to chime in and offer the question can offer it, and so the panelists can see their faces?
So I can do it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I can do it either way. Would you like me to take the spotlights off and then
let's make it more personal.
The whole... Okay, awesome. So I will do that.
And I'm trying to see. you guys have a bunch of yeses and shared resources in here. We're not necessarily a shy group, so anyone that wants to pose a question to the panelists, please feel free.
I think
I have a question, Travis. This is Tracy.
Thank you, Tracy.
My question is regarding policy. So I've been visiting schools, for many years in New York City through my studies in grad school, really. And I was kind of shocked with the amount of trauma and distress and crowded classrooms that I saw. And so I'm just wondering, and now I have a child in public school, and a point was made about, we have to be constantly convincing those who are in charge or leaders to change the policy, especially in my case, the Department of Education and the principals. What are some of the things in our work as partnership with children that we can do to help change the current policies that are in schools that marginalize especially our Black and brown boys? And I have a son in school, so I'm very, very familiar in public school, very familiar with the policies that really seem like after, are structured to take children from school to prison, really, for lack of better words and sake of time. So what are some of the things that we can do in partnership with children that can help really remove or move the needle further in terms of policy?
I think Dr. Case, that might be up your bandwidth.
Sure. I was just going to share an example of what's happening in Minnesota right now, insofar as I said at the beginning, I think that education is movement work, and I think that inside of education, we have a lot to learn from organizing strategies, building coalition. And so I don't think that just means inside of a single institution's walls. So I think it can happen inside of a single institution, a single district where, there's active student groups, there's active family caregiver community groups where their opinions, their perspectives, their wisdoms and brilliance are authentically sought and implemented, right? Because so often we ask folks for their story and then we simply dispose of it. Right, as a checklist item, like, look, we're doing the work. But I think that what is happening right now is a larger coalition in Minnesota across districts where folks have gotten together and are asking, like, what are different policies that can simultaneously be presented at the same time, right, that can layer the work. So one is a youth-led coalition for ethnic studies, right? A really powerful youth-led coalition across the state, not just inside of the Twin Cities metro area, but really organizing across the state for why ethnic studies is so necessary, simply from a truth-telling perspective, right? But also from like a wholeness, wellness perspective, and really thinking about what do we need to change in our schools in order for them to be like humanizing and liberatory spaces. And alongside of that is the coalition is working on 3 different pieces. One is hiring teachers of color and Indigenous teachers, right? Increasing that, and really lays out what would that look like in order for it to move beyond this like recruitment model that doesn't attend to the violences in the system that can predict burnout, right? But is really thinking about what kind of supports are needed for retention, right? And why having Black, Indigenous, and other teachers of color is so crucial for the wellness of our youth. And then the last one is thinking about the school to prison pipeline and eliminating suspensions from pre-K through 4, like just they're not allowed. And then statewide beyond that, how might parents complain when they believe that that suspension is due to race? They're at varying levels of success and how many times they have been presented. But I think the power right now is the fact that youth are leading this conversation. They are at the front of the conversation alongside of educators. And I mean that holistically, like Ezekiel, anybody who works inside of educative spaces, community members, parents, and families.
Thank you, Dr. Case. That was excellent. For anyone who hasn't been to Minnesota or Minneapolis in particular, it's surprisingly diverse in the Twin Cities. But my understanding is you think of it much like New York. The diversity is really concentrated in that urban pocket, and then you get to the rest of the state, and it's very different. Dion, I think you had a question next, and I wanted to get to you.
Yeah, so just when Ms. Case said, that's what I thought about during this whole panel. It kind of gave me an idea of diversity, but also how do we just make it more of a norm for our communities to kind of have this time to talk about their story, and it also sticks as well. But I think just creating programs sometimes it's not always enough to say, okay, we're going to create this program where people get to speak. I was more thinking of how do you make those little steps, because a lot of the times in our community, there may be some tension with law enforcement, of course, the recent stuff going on. How do we take those steps and actually invest time on little steps and it leading up to that program to make us all comfortable, aware, and also when they tell their stories, it's more of it's not just a moment. It's you told us about it. How can we just structure our programs, make our students more comfortable, our parents speaking about it, and just creating that connection between us and the community, like a bridge between both of us, but having a way that it sticks, that this is a normal thing. If situations do come up, we'll always kind of be here to kind of take those steps again, create this program, make them feel comfortable, and just create just an environment where we could just share, but also it stays, not just we talk about it and it goes, but it sticks.
Great question, Dion.
Yeah, I'll just real quickly, yeah, great question. I think this is super important. I was thinking that one of the things that often happens is that we create a forum or a program, and then we bring everybody into the room, and then it just becomes a kind of like parents and community members talking telling their stories at the school district or at the people in charge. What really needs to happen, and Dr. Case mentioned this, critical friends group. We need breakout groups, small groups I could say interdisciplinary, but more like teachers, community members, social workers working together in researching the practices within the district or within the institution. If it's officers, if it's who's ever at the table, we should need to break up into smaller groups and actually do the research and then bring those pieces back together. I think when we do this large space, this large group, parents tell their stories, it becomes a checkbox. It becomes something that the school district can say, well, we got to hear everyone's voice and nothing can get done. I think what happens when we break into coalition groups, affinity groups, and then back in mixing groups, and then also in affinity groups, we can also draw from that as research. Really, one of the things that we need to do, I think, in this moment is super, super important. I know a lot of us care about representation, about getting our voices heard, but what we really need to do is study. You know, a part of what I've learned from from Black studies is the importance of learning together collectively. And I really think I would put that out there, that one of the things we need to do is to sit down, to read together, to think together, and to learn from each other versus just representing voices in public forums, in public spaces in the way that we do sometimes. We need that, and we also need that. But I wonder what it would be to imagine some smaller spaces where we get parents and community members and social workers, everyone at the table, sitting down, problematizing the school structures and the policies that are in place, like the ones about no suspensions, right? Getting everyone sitting down in these small groups and then collectively propose and create a plan, right? It's not just about studying, but then the next step is planning, right? And planning some steps forward, I think would be the most beneficial or kind of useful tactic.
So speaking of propose, Zeke, one of the things I'd like to propose to the panel is as we go forward in our work here to investigate and understand our definition of SEL, can we reach out to you guys to help us reform or reimagine our definition of SEL? And then secondarily, what do any of you have to say, or do you have any advice about the metrics or the pressure to have metrics or measures around SEL? And that'll be the final question as we're like stressed for time.
There's a hand raised too.
It's kind of connected to what Travis just said a little bit, maybe. I don't know.
Did you get that?
Well,
Oh, it is. They're actually very much connected.
yeah, the question is in the chat.
My apologies, it's long.
No worries.
For trying to, get through.
So Zeke, do you mind just, I guess, commenting on the idea of the pressures of having metrics for SEL?
Yeah, I mean, I teach my students, right? Especially I've been working with my pre-service teachers about the idea of grit. I'm sure that you all have heard this. Grit is really interesting because I work at a Hispanic serving institution, so a university that is predominantly Latinx, and what I've learned, and when I go into the bookstore, I pay attention to what books are promoted, and one of the books that they promote is this grit book, and so we know that grit is used and targeted at marginalized students, and we have to ask why, right? And one of the things that this book promotes is assessing students. And one of the things they have is a grit scale. And so what I have my students do is do this grit scale. And I ask them, what does it mean to label a student gritty or not gritty? And what is the work that label does, right? And then what becomes that intervention, right? And we're talking about disciplining, ordering, trying to get that student to assimilate, right? And most of the time what happens is they're not engaged in any critique of how the structures have created that student, the conditions for that student to be non-gritty or whatever, or not gritty, right? And so I think you cannot do that type of work or assessments, motivation assessments, grit assessments, without any interrogation of the structures, especially the social structures in place that might be reproducing racism, sexism, or homophobia, or any other hierarchy. And also I'll say that with the metrics as a whole, right? We cannot, those metrics or any assessments cannot be used without any assessment of its epistemologies. It's what undergirds it, especially if we know that it's working within a white supremacist system.
Thank you, Dr. Joubert. Unfortunately, I think we've reached our bewitching hour. I want to thank the panelists for joining us today and kind of leading this conversation and allowing us to think critically about this work. I definitely will want to come back to you guys as a resource as we have conversations going forward about how we want to reimagine how we define SEL and how we look to incorporate more culturally responsive practices and social justice oriented practices in this work. So I'm going to close on that note. Angela, do you have any final words for the group for the 2-hour session? Zeke?
You're
on mute.
Yeah.
I know I just saw that Greg's hand was up. I don't know if you want to. I'm willing to stay around a couple more minutes to answer.
I did. I had a soft question, but maybe I could. I want to be respectful to everybody's time.
So here's what I'll do. I will share out if Dr. Joubert and Dr. Case don't mind, I can share out their email addresses for any follow-up questions. If you guys are fine.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And so we'll do that. So in case folks
the other thing, Travis, I would say if folks have questions, if they can email it to you, and then we get the answers, and then we share out the answers for everybody, because I don't want to lose any great kind of feedback or answers, because this has been an amazing conversation. So
that's a better idea than my idea. So I'll definitely take that one. So folks, feel free to email me your questions, and then I will share those with the panelists and get back to you and report those out. So I want to thank everyone for their time. I really want to thank the panelists for your time. You volunteered extra work out of your day, and I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I want to echo that as well. I did want to just remind us that there was a question that we were going to just from the chat that was put in before we went for our break. So if Allison, if you want to stick around, I can pose that question to Margaret. But I want to just give the panel a chance to say goodbye. Thank you again. You don't have to stay for the question because it's org related.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out to us, and really appreciate just the conversation and just being in space and holding space with you all. And looking forward to hearing about your work. Hoping that it will be transformative in the ways that you all approach it and imagine it.
Thank you, Dr. Joubert. Kazim, I know you're part of the team, but if you want to definitely share about as well.
Yeah, no, again, it was an honor to speak about the great work that we do. And you guys know me already, you know my email. So, but email Travis, but I'm here if you need help. So yeah, it's an honor.
All right, awesome.